Good evening, everyone. So we've had quite the star-studded lineup today at the India Ideas Conference. We started this morning with Senator Warner. We had Ambassador Verma and Ashley Tellis. We had the youngest member of parliament, Jayavardhan Singh, amongst another lineup of professors, academics, researchers, to all discuss what innovation in India looks like today. After the keynote, we will be having a reception and a research showcase where students will be presenting the research that they've been doing over the last year related to India, along with a documentary screening of Holy Unholy River, a documentary about the Ganges River. But let's get to the main event of today, which is the Chief Economic Advisor of India, who will be keynoting our conference. It's almost impossible to imagine us being here today 3 years ago. 3 years ago, we started the India Initiative. There were 4 students and Professor Nuruddin sitting in an office. We never thought we would be in rigs to a packed hall. We didn't think that we would have any of the speakers who've graced us with their presence here today. And I cannot even begin to tell you what an absolute honor it is to be here to introduce Mr. Subramanian. So Arvind Subramanian is an Indian economist and the current Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He took this position in 2014 after succeeding Raghuram Rajan. He served as the Dennis Weatherstone Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and as the Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development, both located here in Washington, D.C. Formerly an economist at the International Monetary Fund, he is a widely cited expert on the economics of India, China, and the changing balance of the global economy. In 2011, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. It is an absolute pleasure to have him here with us today.
First of all, let me first congratulate the Georgetown India Initiative for having grown so spectacularly in such a short space of time. So. All of you, well done, and keep up the good work. And the more India centers there are around the world, the more Indian soft power spreads. So that's fantastic. I want to thank the organizers and Ambassador Verma, all of you, Irfan, for inviting me here. So let me, I don't know how much time we have. It's 4:30. I have to leave around 5:20 or so. Because I have a meeting at 6 o'clock back. So what I'll try and do is just speak for about 15, 20 minutes and then take questions. And yeah, is that okay? Good. So, we're approaching the kind of 3-year anniversary of this new government. It happens to coincide with the 3-year anniversary of this initiative. Now, and so stepping back and looking back over these 3 years, what has happened, what have been the achievements, what are the things yet to be done, what are the challenges facing the Indian economy. So let me just run through quickly, kind of my take on where we stand and where we might be headed on the Indian economy. First of all, I think it's true that the foundation for everything that is possible in an economy is fundamental macroeconomic stability. When you come to Washington during these spring meetings, all that you hear is that's the basis on which everything else happens. And you might recall that in 2013, India was considered part of the Fragile Five, a country that was almost came to the brink of a financial crisis in the wake of what was then called the taper tantrum. The US Federal Reserve threatened to kind of pull back on its quantitative easing policy, and just that was enough to kind of trigger major upheaval in the emerging markets. And 5 of them, in particular, India was one of them, were quite severely affected. And that happened largely because that it was an economy that was very vulnerable at that point in time. So 4 years on, when you look back, it seems like we've put considerable distance from that. Our inflation is now below 4%. The government has acquired a tremendous track record for being fiscally very prudent. On the external side, we have a lot of foreign exchange reserves. We seem to be very, kind of robust to all the kind of vicissitudes of international markets, including, the vicissitudes of what the Fed may or may not do, what the US government may or may not do. In that sense, I think, and also that we are now, according to the latest data, the fastest growing major economy in the world. I just met Stan Fisher, who's the vice chairman of the US Fed and an old kind of boss of mine at the IMF. So I said, we're growing at 7%. He said, yeah, that's just a notch above 6.9%. And 6.9, of course, is a reference to Chinese rates of growth that have just been posted. So we kind of supposedly have edged China to that #1 spot in terms of growth rate. So, and actually, today at the spring meetings, there is all this talk of a broad-based economic recovery. But even until 4 or 5 months ago, India was considered kind of one of the bright spots of the world economy. And today, in a sense, that all the others have kind of caught up with India because India is kind of going steadily forward on that. So macroeconomic stability, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And one symptom of that, or one manifestation of that, which should be of particular interest to outsiders, is that this year we got about $65 to $70 billion of foreign direct investment. Now, just to give you a sense of that number, a perspective on that number, when China was growing gangbusters, about 10.5%, 11% in the early 2000s, and it was kind of like sucking in foreign direct investment, it was attracting about $100 billion FDI. So kind of at 65, 70 billion, we're not far away from that kind of number. So, and I think India today is the largest recipient of FDI, at least amongst the emerging markets. So in that sense, I think the Indian economy is kind of really in a good situation in that respect. Now, it's not just, I think, the numbers that are convincing investors around the world. I think it is backed up by the sense that some pretty important reforms have taken place in the last few years. Let me highlight 3 or 4 of them, which I think are really very important. I mentioned foreign direct investment. Underlying that huge surge in inflows has also been a major reform of the FDI regime. Pretty much, I think, India, apart from a few sectors which are, I think, regulated all over the world, like media, for example, the Indian FDI regime is kind of quite open, or almost maybe a few pockets here and there, multi-brand retail, as I said, media, but otherwise there's been a lot of liberalization of the FDI regime. So that, I think, is a very important reform. I think the other important reform that has taken place, the government has enacted a series of laws that would make bankruptcy much easier. We've also enacted reforms that codify the institutional relationship between the government and the RBI so that macroeconomic stability and inflation control are now kind of codified into law, as it were. So that kind of reassures investors that inflation and macroeconomic stability is not a kind of subject to the whims of individuals or the caprice of governments, but that it actually has some more solid institutional basis. But I mean, I think these are all important, but I think the 3 big things that have really changed in India in the last few years. One, this is a point that comes out best in its contrast with the past. If you remember, towards the end of 2013, around that time, India seemed to be really scandal and corruption-ridden. The auctioning of public assets in particular, there were major corruption scandals. Spectrum, coal, land, all these were kind of allocated very arbitrarily, a lot of discretion, environmental clearances as well. So I think I used the phrase then, it was the kind of rents raj, rents were being really creamed off the system. And I characterized them as, ethereal rents, spectrum, terrestrial rents, land, and subterranean rents, coal. So, all kind of rents were being taken off the system. But now, I think the government has acquired a reputation for absolutely transparently auctioning the public all public assets. And I think in some sense, I think that's really the government and the Prime Minister in particular have gained a lot of credibility on that score of it being a relatively corruption-free regime. And you see this also, partly in the disappointment of foreign, all kinds of companies who feel that they don't have enough access to power. The flip side of that, of course, is that this kind of distance and the arm's length process is actually symptomatic of a large reduction in corruption and discretion in decision making. So that, I think, is one major thing. The second, I think, absolutely, I would call this a kind of mini revolution that's happened in the last few years, is what we call the JAM architecture. For those of you who may not know Hindi, J stands for Jan Dhan, which is the financial bank accounts that have been opened. About 250 to 300 million accounts have been opened, J. A stands for Aadhaar, the biometric identification, and now about 1.1 billion adults have been biometrically identified, and M is mobile. So JAM, essentially, it refers to the coming together of these three kind of technologies / government initiatives, which I think the potential they hold for much more efficient delivery of government services, I mean, the potential is just enormous. Already, for example, India has the largest cooking gas direct transfer scheme for the cooking gas subsidy. It's the world's biggest cash transfer program. I believe it's even bigger than the Brazilian Bolsa Familia. And a whole bunch of government services are being now delivered through cash. But we're only in the early stages. There's a lot more to go. But for example, a study that we did on the cooking gas subsidy, the saving is something like 20–25% just by reducing leakage, eliminating ghost beneficiaries, and so on. So the potential for this to spread to all government services is actually quite enormous. And then, of course, the last, and for me, the mother of all reforms that have taken place recently is the goods and services tax. It's something that I've had the good fortune and privilege of being associated with. But last year in August, we passed a constitution amendment bill. Essentially, what it's going to do is to create a single market by having one tax, one value-added tax on goods and services, the same tax levied by all the states, no taxes on the flow of goods between states. So it's going to create a common market, and of course, it's also going to create a huge boost in tax compliance. The number that kind of boggles the imagination is that when this system is up and running, every month, 3 billion invoices will be matched automatically by the IT system. And that's where the compliance benefits will come in. Because remember that in a value-added tax, for me to claim a credit for the tax that I've paid to my supplier, I need to show that I've paid the tax. So I have an incentive to force the guy behind me in the chain to actually maintain records. So what's going to happen is that he will have to produce an invoice, I will have to produce an invoice, and 3 billion such invoices will be matched automatically, so that the scope for then actually evading comes down quite a bit. In the limit, we can conceive of a situation where people themselves knowing this, taxpayers themselves knowing this, will actually start voluntarily complying as well. So this is a really remarkable reform. It's remarkable in another, a much bigger kind of non-economic sense, which is that, and this is something, by the way, would be inconceivable in the United States, because essentially what has happened is that the center has been levying these taxes, states have been levying these taxes, and now each of these 29 states in the center have basically had to, in some ways, give up their sovereignty to levy these taxes and then do everything collectively. The Europeans understand this language, which I think Americans will never will, of the states and the center pooling sovereignty, not giving up sovereignty, but pooling sovereignty. But the thing is that, every tax decision now on this VAT, on the goods and service tax, administration, procedure, the levels, the exemptions, will have to be decided cooperatively. So I call this a kind of daring and bold reform in the governance of cooperative federalism in India. So as a federation, we come together, the center and the states, and really on every tax matter, there has to be cooperation. So in that sense, I think it's quite a far-reaching reform in that sense. Let me talk, I leave the D word for question and answers, and so because there's a lot to talk about. So let me spell out, what the major challenges of the economy are. I think there is one, maybe perhaps two really big short-term challenges. The major short-term challenge in the short run is that, the macro challenge in the short run is that we have what we call a twin balance sheet problem, which is really holding back private investment and credit in the economy. Firms, you see, most of this is a legacy of the kind of rah-rah, go-go years of the 2000s, when there was a boom in growth and in infrastructure investment, a lot of irrational exuberance. Everyone, to use that Citibank guy's term, everyone was dancing, and no one wanted to withdraw from the party. So there was a lot of investment, and then of course, when growth went from 9 to 6.5, 7, many of those investments have kind of they don't seem as profitable as they used to be. So as a result, on the one hand, the private corporate sector has a lot of debt. It's over-indebted. It's not able to service these debts. And as a result of that, the banks that lend to them, which are mostly public sector banks, also have a lot of kind of bad assets on their books. So resolving this, I think, is key to getting credit going again, and to reviving private investment in the economy, because private investment remains quite weak at this stage. The government, of course, is seized of this problem. There have been lots of discussions on this, for the last 1 year, and even now as we speak. And the government is aware that tackling this is going to be key to making whatever growth we have sustainable over the medium term. Another challenge which has kind of recently reared its head is, of course, you see what's been happening in terms of some states saying that they want to waive off all agricultural loans. I think that this is something that we need to be, monitor very carefully, because it has the potential to upset the government. You see, the central government has had in the last year's terrific record of fiscal consolidation, steadily reducing the deficit, curbing wasteful expenditures, raising more revenue. That's happened, but there is a possibility and a risk that some of this could be, undone by the states. I like to be somewhat stupidly literary in my way of describing things. I say the center is like Penelope that, stitched during the day, and the states is Penelope at night that kind of unravels all that was stitched during the day. So it's kind of center as the Penelope during the day, and that Penelope, in order to ward off her suitors in Ulysses, had to keep playing this game so that she, to await the return of her husband. So in a sense, the states have the potential or are at risk of undermining the fiscal consolidation at the center. So those are the short-term challenges. I think, I don't know whether I'm boring you all of you. Do I have 2 to 3 more minutes? And then, yeah, and then, so let me talk about the kind of more the structural challenges. If I were a little bit, in a kind of preachy mode, I would say, or in a slightly irritable mode, I might say, instead of telling you what the structural challenges of the economy are, I would force you to read Chapter 2 of this year's economic survey. I hope it's compulsory reading at Georgetown University in the India course. But that kind of spells out, I think, what I think are the and these are challenges that are not specific to this government or the previous government. It's just, I think, something that successive governments have faced, and it has to do with kind of the ecosphere of ideas in India. What is possible? What do people really believe collectively in some ways? And therefore, to overcome this, it would be almost sort of unfair to point fingers at any one government to say, oh, you haven't done this, because I think in order to do these things, a deeper societal consensus has to develop around these, I think, three major challenges. Challenge number one, I think, is that we have very extensive and inefficient redistribution. Remember, a poor country like India, lots of cleavages in society. Such societies have to redistribute. I mean, that's very important. But the question is that, can we do it in efficient ways? And so in that sense, we've done some work showing that many of the current anti-poverty programs have a lot of leakage. They don't even effectively reach, the poorest what they're meant to. And so can we change that? I mean, I think, and this is where another idea, that we've revived, and it's kind of, people are talking more and more about this, is the concept of a universal basic income. Can we, roll all these anti-poverty programs into a universal basic income? That might be, less inefficient redistribution, maybe even less costly in some ways. So how do we deal with this much bigger issue? We give subsidies for fertilizer, power, water, agricultural prices, kerosene, fuel, food. So can we, think about making this more efficient? I think that's a big challenge. Subsidies in India, I would say, if you rolled all of these things together, easily would be 3 to 4% of GDP. So it's a big number, and that's something that we need to address. Second big challenge is, I do think at some deep level in India, there is a kind of ambivalence about the private sector. And this is something that, everyone focuses on. There are lots of manifestations of that. The strategic disinvestment program has not been as active perhaps as it should be. We still have public sector banks, public sector civil aviation companies, public sector telecommunication companies, and there is this desire on the part of people to actually, that we should, the government should, not do some of these things where it doesn't have comparative advantage in, kind of inconsistent with the Prime Minister's, minimum government, maximum governance slogan. But I think we haven't made as much progress on this as perhaps we should. I mean, that being said, I say this, but all of you must realize that the size of the public sector in India has shrunk over time. And and that's happened because we've allowed more and more private sector entry into all these. Earlier there used to be one national airline. Now there are many, many airlines. So even though the public sector company exists, its significance is diminished because we've had all these private sector guys come into it. If I were to, in fact, this is something we said in last year's survey. If I were to have a one-liner, throwaway one-liner to capture what's happened in some fundamental sense to the Indian economy over the last 50 years, I would say we've gone from socialism with limited entry to capitalism without exit. Exit is a big problem in India, whether it's the public sector, whether it's the subsidies, whether it's the bad loans that we're in, it's proving very, very difficult to get exit. So I think redistribution, difficulty of exit, ambivalence about the private sector, I think are very important challenges. The most important, perhaps, the deepest challenge I would say is that, I think over the last 70 years, India hasn't done a terrific job on providing basic education and health to its population. I think in some ways, if you think that long-run development based on people basically being healthy and productive and educated, I think we have a long way to go. But there, let me also to kind of preempt some questions that might come. Let me pose the question that I would have liked you to pose, but now we don't have the time for you to pose. Let me put it this way: that the challenge here is not just people say, why doesn't the government, or why haven't governments in the past invested more in health and education? I would actually like to, I think, turn that around and ask and say that the really interesting question and important question to ask is not why the governments haven't provided it, but why is it that the people through the democratic process have not applied much applied enough pressure on governments to force them to deliver better health and education. Because remember, it should be in principle politically an opportunity for for politicians to say, there are so many, poorly educated, not very healthy kids. I mean, if you could, provide this, surely it should be a great political opportunity, but that just hasn't happened. And the puzzle is that we have, health and education are things that state governments actually have predominant control over. So the question is not just why haven't people put pressure on the central government, but why haven't people in the different states put pressure on governments to deliver better health and education? Remember that after growth took off, the returns to education are so high that people see the value of education, and yet we haven't seen this pressure. Just to let me end with an anecdote that we've just had this big election in Uttar Pradesh recently, and I was in India following the election campaign, and every day we used to have huge newspaper ads in all the newspapers, English and Hindi newspapers, because it was happening in Uttar Pradesh, where the incumbent, would kind of say, I built this road from New Delhi to Agra, thinking that that would be what would turn voters on, in kind of voting for him. So the thought crossed my mind, why haven't politicians kind of said, instead of, trumpeting the roads that, few people use in that sense, why can't politicians trumpet the fact that, we've educated 30 million children, we've provided health to 70 million, of the population, and see that as a vote winner? That is, I think, one of the deepest puzzles of Indian political economy. And I think this is something that I think we're going to, these are ongoing challenges. But I think I just want to end on a hopeful note by saying that I do believe in some fundamental sense that what is going to keep India going, apart from the reforms at the center, is also this dynamic of the competition between states. Some states do good things. Those are kind of, followed and copied by others. And it sets in motion something very positive. And more, I think democratic politics does reward good governance. It hasn't rewarded, building schools and hospitals and having teachers show up in schools, but it's certainly rewarded less corruption, more growth, less inflation, so on. So I think this competition between states dynamic will take hold, it will spread, and for the next, I'm optimistic that at least for the next 15, 20 years, India should be growing at about 8 to 10%, provided we do all these, basic things. And so the future for all of you to work on India, to come to India, to work in India, on India is very bright. So welcome to all of you to India. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Definitely really appreciated you saying that health and education is where the future is. Hopefully that's what I get to do. So next we're going to have a couple of moderated question answers with Professor Shireen Joshi. Professor Joshi is an assistant professor in Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and has gotten her PhD from Yale University and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. After the few questions, we'll be opening the floor for questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mrs. Brahmanian. If I may, I want to go back to JAM. Right, so as an applied microeconomist, I totally agree. I see the argument about a program, the programs under JAM reducing leakages, improving efficiency, reducing transaction costs. But the big issues in India have always been about implementation. And I work in the tribal areas of Rajasthan. And if I think about some of the villages where I work, I think the majority of women are illiterate for the reasons that you just explained. They don't have access to bank accounts. The programs we're studying are SAG programs that's attempting to link them to the formal banking sector. They largely work in the informal sector. So as we think about, these are the women or the families that poverty alleviation programs most need to target. But in some sense, even JAM programs and the UBI program would likely be expensive to deliver to them. So how do we think about that? How do we think about the challenge of delivering the last mile of these services to women in tribal areas or places where they have no clear linkage to the formal sector of the Indian government?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So certainly, better delivery of services will depend upon getting that last mile thing done. But let me say a few things. Firstly, I think in the last few years we have opened up these Jan Dhan accounts.
Yes.
And the public sector banks in fact have been responsible. So that's spreading slowly but steadily. And as I said, there are about 250 million or maybe 275 million bank accounts. So I think that has to spread. One. Second, I think that if you think about what is interesting about this jam is that on the one hand, as more and more people get mobile, right, that's going to be easy to make this a thing. But the really, kind of tantalizing new development also is that people, even without cell phones, can have use their biometric, identity to actually, benefit from some of these services. For example, I've been in Krishna district in Andhra Pradesh, right? And what happens there is you have a public distribution system that gives food. So essentially, how do they get food or how do they pay for food? So they go there, they show up, and then you have these POS machines where you can just do your biometric identification, and then your bank account gets debited, and then you pay for it. So in that sense, people don't even need to have phones to access some of these government services. Now, so it is going to, but we have by no means solved that last mile problem, but I think we're making great progress, and I think this is going to improve steadily. Remember, however, that when this question is posed, and this is probably the most important point, is that you have to compare this with what is happening today. Today, the same ladies, for example, that you deal with in the self-help group, I mean, what is their access to the current services that the government is providing? So the question is, can we improve upon this in some significant way? Because remember that in some sense, the advantage of having this infrastructure and this UBI is that you do kind of, avoid or circumvent all these layers of bureaucracy in the middle, which are the source of corruption and leakage going forward. I mean, we know, for example, that the leakage and corruption in many of these programs is very high. So in some sense, the kind of dream prospect is that, if you can just deliver, if you build the last mile, and that'll take time, you just have to, transfer the money straight to bank accounts, sometimes with, sometimes without mobile. And, that has to be a considerable improvement on what happens today.
So a related question, though, is if we compare, where we are today, we view these programs, then there's another kind of political challenge about how do you break the vested interests that are profiting from subsidies and these types of programs today? So how do you get rid of a failed program and replace it one in a democracy where that program may have its supporters? Yeah,
so I think that is a very, very good and important question because when we talk about universal basic income, we calculate that it will cost something like 4.5–5% of GDP. That becomes only fiscally affordable if you can actually phase down the existing ones. So I think that I have no good solution to that except to say that in the case of the cooking gas subsidy, we have actually kind of
done it. Yes.
Overcome that problem. But that's not to say that can be replicated or easily transferred. For example, now there's a direct benefit pilots happening in fertilizer. The fertilizer subsidy, which I think is one of the most egregiously, ineffective subsidies, and has a number of deleterious effects on agriculture, on health, on water usage, power usage. There, I think we're encountering this problem that essentially, if you deliver this, the man in the middle. You see, remember, or to put it differently, we always talk about, the last mile challenge. In this, there's a real middle mile challenge because, the guy in the middle, the intermediary. In this case, it could be the guy who runs the PDS shop. he has a vested interest in not having leakage and wastage being reduced, because that's where he gets his money. So I think we have to do a number of things. We have to be very creative about this. To some extent, in some ways, when we introduce this, we may have to increase what we reward these intermediaries with. I mean, in the interim, you may conceivably have to give them more in order to keep their interest in this, so that we don't run into the kinds of problems that that you quite rightly point to.
But I think your point about, India civil society, like why is it that people have not demanded more of the government on education and health? Maybe a strengthening of civil society, which we do see happening, might make some of this in the realm of possible as well as we look forward to these.
Civil society is great everywhere, and all power to civil society. It's just that I think, with civil society, the classic problem, of course, is that scale.
Absolutely.
Can you get the scale to really put pressure on the democratic political process to actually change some of these things that are very important? You do hear lots of good stories about things happening in different places, but unless it kind of comes together in something big and changes fundamentally the incentives in the democratic political process, we'll have to wait and see.
I think the big question on the audience's mind is the big D.
Okay.
Instead of me posing that question, I'm going to leave it to the audience to crowdsource it, amongst other questions too. So I'll turn it over.
But let me just say that before those questions come, I don't know. I'm not part of the millennial generation, so my thing might be wrong. But let's put it this way: demonetization is so yesterday.
Questions, please. Ambassador Verma, please.
Yes. First of all, thank you for being here. It's great to see you. I want to ask about trade agreements, different international trade. And I take some, solace in reading the paper and seeing the frustration of the Australians and the Canadians and the Europeans in trying to bring their kind of trade agreements with India to a conclusion or a final negotiation. In the Canadian case, I think they're going on a decade of negotiations. And then there's been the effort to renegotiate a number of trade agreements that India has already entered into. And of course, we, working with you, took the view last year that we just weren't ready to go either to a bilateral investment treaty or to something more ambitious. I guess I'm trying to determine, is this a calculated strategy? Is this the equivalent of kind of four corners basketball where you're trying to ice the clock on the negotiations? Or are these just really hard things to get done and they take a lot of time? Or is really India just doesn't want to enter into these kinds of agreements right now?
So, Rich, I think that here I would distinguish the investment treaties from the trade ones. Sorry to get a little bit into the weeds here, but you have trade agreements and you have investment agreements. So India has allowed all its investment agreements to lapse and is kind of, wanting to renegotiate them. I think the dynamic on the investment agreements, I think, is very different from the trade agreements. And let me spell out why. I think it's a lot more hopeful and positive on the trade side. See, the thing is that with the bilateral investment agreements, today, as I said, we're getting $60, $70 billion of FDI. So the old argument when investors, foreigners come and say, please, if you don't do it, our investors will not come. And that's now doesn't sound credible anymore, right? Because investors are kind of flocking in. So in that sense, the balance of power on negotiating investment has kind of shifted to us. You're growing rapidly. Everyone wants to come to India to invest. That's one. Second is that we have had this experience of, a lot of litigation under these investment treaties. So the government has decided, I think quite rightly, to, look at it afresh and to see how, this kind of sometimes even, frivolous litigation, spurious litigation, how that can be minimized. So I think that process will take time. But for the reason that I spelled out, the urgency for that is not as great as it perhaps was earlier. On the trade side, I think, things are a bit different. I think that, that especially the way the world is changing, I mean, there is recognition that we cannot grow at 8% until our exports grow by 15, 20%, one. Two, but for that we need open global markets. And more, I hope the realization that, countries like India and China have the responsibility to maintain these open markets because others are ceding or giving up or relinquishing this responsibility, as we all know. So in that sense, I think there is that realization. And even from a kind of employment sense in India, we look at clothing, footwear, and so on, where we want to reclaim some of these labor-intensive sectors. I mean, part of the solution we recognize is the fact that export markets have a lot of barriers. EU, for example, tariffs on clothing and footwear, 15, 20%. So I think we are much more open. We're very keen. Our trade minister has been very vocal in saying that we do want to negotiate, especially agreements with the European Union now, and perhaps the United Kingdom down the road when the Article 50 process is sorted out. So I think we do want to be more proactive on these trade agreements, and I'm hoping that will happen over time. But there is a difference between the trade and the investment side.
So, how about we go to a student in the back? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam. I wanted to ask you about. Now, the government, being a government, owns many things: land, military, etc., etc. Some of those things are firms. Some of those are things like LIC, MTNL, which provide basic services. Others are more cumbersome, like a number of larger banks, Air India. My question to you is, do you feel that the government should be involved in all of these? The government has been trying to disinvest from these. What issues are there in this process? Why is it taking so long? And
See, I alluded to that, right? I do think that, it's not. That's why I think it's very unfair to say why isn't this government, because no government has been able to do it for the last many, many years. And as I said, I do think there is this, there's a kind of generic ambivalence about this, but in individual sectors, the problems are different. So in the case of Air India, for example, right? In the case of Air India, we have, if you wanted to disinvest, there will be an issue with the labor unions, which you'll have to address, and it's not easy to address that. With Air India, you may have to, if you were serious about this, you may have to sell it at a negative price, and I think that no political system finds it easy to kind of give away assets for free, regardless of what but politically to say, we're actually going to give it away for free or it actually pay you to take it off, it's very difficult for any political system to do, especially if you have this fundamental ambivalence about the private sector. Mm-hmm. In the case of the public sector banks, it's a bit different because, there is a sense in which the government wants to still allocate resources to certain, very important sectors. So I think, the problems vary from sector to sector, but underlying that is, we haven't really come to, any societal consensus that we want to. I can guarantee you that if some government said we're going to announce privatization of the public sector banks, across the political spectrum, there will be opposition to it. It's not a kind of a one party versus the other party.
Mm-hmm. All the way in the back. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for an interesting discussion. I'm Vatsal Bhatt, and I wanted to talk to you about energy policies. And a lot is happening these days in energy policies and renewable and all those things. Still, I think a lot of discussion is top-heavy, top-down kind of discussion. So how that is changing for a better, fast-paced discussion in many of these areas?
So, you need to be a bit more specific. What exactly do you mean by that?
So right now, when policies are designed at the national level, many of these local concerns are not being discussed. So my question is...
Give an example. I'm not trying to, but I would love to know what the example is. Are you talking about, the renewable target? Are you talking about coal? I mean, what exactly do you have in mind?
Say, let's take about renewable targets.
Yeah.
Many of these, renewable targets are taken care of just as a national level broad discussion, right? All these big targets. Now, how about working?
I think. In fact, Al Gore yesterday was speaking at the World Bank meeting on energy, and he was really raving about the Indian, renewable energy target and the ambition of that target. And you must have seen, for example, at all these recent auctions, the price of solar now is very low. So there is kind of the heady prospect that, renewable energy is kind of taking off in India. So that's why, I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I just would like you to be a bit more specific and give some examples. That's what I mean, yeah.
Sure. For an example, like I had worked a lot with Niti Aayog on energy policies and Dr. Parikh and others as well. So here the discussion is that can we really start looking into some of these detailed policies when local, state level agencies are also being considered in many of this discussion? Because when we talk about some of these big projects being deployed from the national level, then the local capacity to handle it, local capacity to deploy it is very different. And that's where they get stranded in the pipeline, basically. So not only from the big projects, even from the small projects on the solar side and all those kind of discussion.
I just maybe I don't have a good sense for what's happening at the local level, so I'll just pass on that question. But I do think one of the more exciting things happening in India is the emphasis on renewable and solar. The question I thought you might ask is that what's happening to coal and what is the impact that solar is having on coal as well. So those are some interesting dynamics, I think, which we need to sort through, because on the one hand, if you get this cheap solar, it's great for the environment, but to the extent that it makes a conventional energy unviable, there are kind of broader implications in terms of the viability of those projects, what it does to the banking system, which is kind of exposed to these. So there are all those issues going on, but I just don't know enough about what's happening at the micro level in terms of implementation.
So there's a lady right here.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to ask you, given the NPA problem and that it's impacting banks and investment in the country and thereby impacting unemployment, what do you think the government needs to do? Because banks aren't being penalized for the fact that they took on these bad loans.
Yeah, I think what my own preferred view, and it's something also that the Deputy Governor of the RBI also articulated a month ago. One clean solution would be to just create a bad bank. You take out, if you look at all the emerging market crises, emerging markets that got into this kind of crisis, not just emerging, China, the East Asians, Sweden, and even TARP was a kind of bad bank as well in some respects. To take out all these assets from the banks, resolve them and get on with the process. Now, see, even your question, I think, is a little bit kind of loaded, and I want to point that out. You said, why haven't they been punished for this? You see, I think in all this, you have to be a little bit careful because, there are at least two classes or broad classes of bad loans, right? In one case, they did actually crooked things, illegal things for which they need to be punished. But then a lot of these decisions were just honest but bad decisions. When an economy is growing at 9%, everyone thinks it's going to grow for 9% for another 10 years, and then you overinvest. So in those cases, these were, your approach to that unfortunately has to be, different. That you have to say, well, mistakes were made, therefore, how do you, cut your losses and then move on? So that calls for a different kind of solution as well. But here too, the heart of the problem is the following. The heart of the problem is the public sector banks lent to the private sector companies. The loans went bad. So a big part of the resolution going forward is that you may have to forgive, loans to the private sector. And again, the political system, and especially if some of these private sector borrowers are actually big companies, well-connected companies, there's always the fear that, and that's why the banks are not taking this decision. Middle-level bank managers cannot afford to write down loans because they feel that, even if it's done in good faith, they will be accused of nepotism and corruption. And so there's kind of a freeze on this kind of decision making.
Do we have time for one last question?
We have, it's 5, okay. We have time for, maybe one or two more questions, and then we have to rush.
All right,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Thank you, sir. This is Amshika Amar. And, like in India right now, we have like great innovative policies in terms of like urban policy, social policy, infrastructure policy. And, we sort of have an opportunity to learn from experiences of different countries. But with demonetization, you could see like people actually partaking.
I thought I'd
Sure.
escaped it, but
No, well, yeah. But
Here it comes.
And, people actually going and partaking in that policy thing, So, but what do you think is the biggest challenge in sort of implementing these great policies that, India is obviously coming up with? Is it just bureaucracy, or is it something else that you feel is bigger challenge than that?
Hold on,
Yes,
okay, sure.
you did.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Subramaniam. I'm Atul Menon, a graduate student here at Georgetown University. I had a technical question on the GST. I've read your report. I was wondering what you had to say about the multi-rate structure for the GST and how effective it's going to be moving forward as the game changer, as they call it.
Yeah, I think that it's a as I said, it's a game-changing reform. The best can often be the enemy of the good. I think that ideally we should have had a much simpler rate structure, maybe just 1 or 2, maybe maximum 3 rates. I think we're going to have more than that. But on balance, I still think it's very good to do, because if you create multiple rates, it's going to be administratively more difficult to administer. There will be more kind of gaming of the system. So compliance that way will be challenged. But I think that even with those shortcomings, I think it's a great tax to have because it will vastly improve upon the status quo. So I think in that sense, even with given the fact that it's a multiple rate structure, more rates than were ideally desirable, I still think it's a really welcome change, big reform, and hopefully over time we can learn from this. So for example, if we see too many rates, maybe over time we can actually merge some of these slabs, reduce the rates, and so on. So there's scope for learning by doing here as well.
So on that note, I'm going to thank our speaker. Please put your hands together and thank Mr. Subramanian.
I would be disingenuous, and I think I would be, remiss. Let me just say one thing about demonetization.
We were almost about to let you go without that.
But so let me.
Now it's coming from him.
Let me be the self-sacrificing lamb here. I think there are lots of things one can say about demonetization. I think, I would urge you to read the chapter in the survey where we tried to be very, fair and balanced, saying that there would be short-term costs and medium-term, potential medium-term benefits. I do think that, the costs were felt. I think we're unfortunately not going to be able to actually get a good macro assessment of those costs because most of them were in the informal sector. But it's also true to say that, those costs are behind us now because the problem was a cash shortage. Now the cash has, mostly come back, so we've remonetized the economy. But I will say 2 tantalizing things, as I kind of throw these things. One, there are 2 things that really, have humbled me as both an economist and as a kind of, political scientist, whatever. I'm not a political scientist, so as a kind of general political economy guy who tries to understand this. One, I have been surprised by how attenuated the economic impact has been compared to what I thought it would be and compared to the scale of the cash squeeze that was affected for some period of time. It is, and there are some explanations, for example, in agriculture, why that happened. I think there was a lot more use of informal credit arrangements, a lot more shift to digitalization. Also in agriculture, perhaps more self-employed labor being used for formal labor. So, but that's, I think, but those are only partial answers. I think, all of you doing research, I think, would do this. And on the political side, I mean, I've been humbled. Robert Solow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, had a famous saying that, all these, discussions in economics begin with great rigor and end in a blaze of amateur sociology. So, in terms of amateur and armchair psychologizing, I have been, the kind of response to this, the political response to demonetization, I think is something that we didn't expect, and it's been resoundingly in favor of. I mean, to the extent that one can read the UP election as a kind of a referendum on demonetization. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. But to the extent that it is, I mean, it was. I mean, all of you who must have been to India must have seen or met someone who was standing in line, who said.
I stood in line,
yeah.
sir.
But I'm sure, Rich, you didn't say this, but many people apparently said we are willing to take this cost because we think it's for a larger purpose. I don't know whether you said that, Rich. Actually, I don't know. But I do think there's something about understanding the political economy of this, which I think is fascinating. It's certainly humbled me as a kind of armchair political economist. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Has to leave, but I wanted to take a moment to just thank a lot of different people who made this conference possible. You're our keynote speaker. We're very grateful you're here. But Ambassador Verma, Stephen Cohen at the Brookings Institution, Senator Mark Warner, all the panelists, there are too many for me to thank, but thank you so much for coming to Georgetown from this behalf of all our students. The student board, Nandini, Naomi, Chinmaya, Nikunj, Anya, Nitya, Beverly, Gunther, Arjun, Yash, Darshil, and Emily. I mean, Emily, thank you for all the work you did. But most significantly, I have no words to thank Irfan Nuruddin for putting this all together. As Nandini already said, 3 years ago, we were very far away from this point, and it's like a dream come true for me personally to be here. So thank you so much again.